In 2003, Tarana Burke founded Just to Be Incorporated, a nonprofit meant to increase the well-being of young women of color. After listening to numerous stories of women and girls who had been victimized, Burke needed to find a way to empathize with the women and their experiences. She coined the phrase "Me Too" as a way for survivors of sexual assault to stand in solidarity with one another. However, it wasn't until actress Alyssa Milano tweeted the phrase that #MeToo blew up and truly became a rallying cry for women affected by sexual harassment and assault. Despite her surprise at the massive attention her phrase from over a decade ago was now receiving, Burke saw a problem. Speaking at the Time 100 Summit, Burke discussed how the movement has focused on influential men in Hollywood and their white female celebrity accusers, with many voices remaining unheard. Reese Taylor, Anita Hill, and now Tarana Burke are all Black women who have led the movement against sexual violence by speaking publicly about their experiences. While there are many stories to be told, such as the unique experiences of Indigenous or trans people, we have chosen to focus on the experience of Black women dealing with sexual violence.
In order to understand the current experiences of female Black sexual assault survivors, we must understand the socio-historical background causing us to reach this point. Much of the sexual assault experiences of Black women today can be traced back to the antebellum era and the stereotypes it created and implicit biases it caused. Rima Sood provides an excellent history of the hypersexualization of Black women in America in her article for University of Maryland Law Journal of Race, Religion, Gender, and Class. Black women had no control over their own bodies, which allowed the offspring produced by the rape of a Black slave to be born into slavery. There was no limit to the raping and brutalization of Black women, as they were not protected by any laws. White women felt resentment toward raped Black slaves because of the attention, despite how horrific it was, the slaves were receiving from their husbands. In order to justify the centuries of abuse, white men created a false narrative about Black women, describing them as salacious and lewd. They even decided they couldn't be held accountable for their actions because of the inherent sexual nature and promiscuity of Black women. Sood argues, quote, "The systematic rape of Black slaves remains relevant to our present-day understanding of the problems facing Black women as the biases and judgments embedded themselves in modern consciousness." End quote. The historic hypersexualization of Black women persists today, perhaps as an example of implicit bias, but also in our legal system. The landmark Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott v. Sanford withheld American citizenship from anyone of African descent, regardless of whether or not they were free, which, according to Sood, increased the severity of Black female oppression. Another Supreme Court decision aided in the subjugation of Black women, only this time it was by Black men. In George v. State of Mississippi, the rape conviction of a Black slave was overturned because raping a Black female slave was legal. These implicit biases formed by Supreme Court decisions and false justifications for the rape of Black women impact how sexual violence against Black women is perceived today. Patricia Washington's article for the Violence Against Women Journal also describes the impact of Black men on today's stereotypes and implicit bias towards Black women. The sexuality and reproductive abilities of Black women were also treated as commodities by Black men, specifically young civil rights activists who told them to throw away their birth control pills and have a baby for the Black Revolution. Rima Sood's article also discusses another major issue Black female victims of sexual violence face, which are barriers to reporting crimes and the underlying issue of intersectionality. The intersection of race and gender have impacted the way the rape of Black women is handled today. A large issue is the abuse and neglect of Black women by law enforcement that has led to severe distrust in the legal system to protect them. The previous slide provided a quote highlighting the importance of justice and violence prevention. However, Black women are frequently denied access to justice due to things like poor investigation of rape allegations or sexual assault charges not being pursued by prosecutors. While the report from the Department of Justice showed similarity in the prevalence of rape for Black and white women, Sood argues that these numbers may be less than accurate due to the barriers Black women face when reporting, thus leading to underreporting. Decker et al. Explored the race and gender-based inequities that impact the rate of reporting violence against women in the Journal of Urban Health. They identified multiple structural influences on police reporting, many of which were identified by Black women but not by white women in the study. One barrier was a perceived lack of care from the police felt by many women in the study. They had experienced disregard and apathy in police interactions, which in turn caused them to feel law enforcement has a lack of concern for their well-being. Another barrier was power disparity, an issue not raised by white women. The women had to use survival tactics due to this power imbalance between themselves and law enforcement despite already being victimized, which kept them from reporting their assault. Fear of harm, both to themselves and their partner, from police was another barrier to reporting raised by black women who were very much aware of the police brutality within their community of Baltimore City and elsewhere. With this multitude of hindrances to reporting sexual violence, it makes sense that intimate partner violence and sexual violence are two of the most underreported crimes, with the non-report rate continuing to increase.
An additional issue Black sexual assault survivors face is a lack of access to resources. According to the National Organization for Women, Black women are just as likely to lack access to mental and physical health services as they are more likely to experience intimate partner violence. An article in the Journal of Family Violence discusses the resources Black women have in abusive relationships. While not addressing sexual assault specifically, the authors make a very useful point in understanding the experiences of Black women who are sexually assaulted. The authors explain that Black women have doubts when trying to find a therapist or other professional help because they don't feel they will be knowledgeable on what they experience as a person who is not only a woman, but a Black woman. In addition to the continued importance of intersectionality in this discussion, another stereotype must be considered. The narrative of Black female promiscuity was not the only stereotype born from the antebellum period. Lisa M. Martinson discusses the impact racism and stereotypes have on access to resources for Black women in Wisconsin Women's Law Journal. Providing the quote you see from Zanita Fenton, professor of law, she explains the strong Black woman stereotype that was formed by slavery and how it has made Black women unable to be perceived as victims. By being stereotyped as the opposite of a middle or upper class white woman who is viewed as delicate and soft, Black women were forced into the role of the caregiver and now have nowhere to turn when they are in need of care.
As previously discussed, the implicit bias held by law enforcement largely impacts the way sexual violence allegations made by Black women are handled. Mandatory implicit bias training would reveal these unconscious biases, teach ways of dealing with this harmful pattern of thinking, and help prevent future inequitable and discriminatory actions.
Sood highlights that the 34th Congress anticipated lingering effects of slavery after abolishment and supported use of the 13th Amendment to address these persistent inequities. For instance, the 13th Amendment allowed the 1866 Civil Rights Act to be passed, granting citizenship to everyone born in the United States. The hypersexualization of Black women has created bias in the handling of allegations of sexual assault from them. We must use the 13th Amendment to create a policy addressing this lasting remnant of slavery.
During our research about the lack of resources for Black women, we learned that an important place for advocates is in school. However, we also found that most districts lack counseling service or are over capacity. It is for this reason we think an important solution is lobbying for improved supports in schools so that young victims have a place to go to learn about the options they have, someone to help direct them to useful resources for dealing with sexual violence and potentially seeking charges, and overall, a place to feel heard, which, as depicted by the Me Too movement, is largely missing for minority women.